The clinking of dishes echoed softly through the small kitchen as Sienna stood by the sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water. The setting sun bathed the room in hues of gold and amber, but the tranquility was deceptive. Beneath the quiet, her thoughts churned. Her late husband Ethan's face flickered in her mind, a haunting memory she could neither embrace nor escape. His smile used to anchor her, but now it haunted her, a specter of a life violently ripped away. She glanced at the calendar pinned to the refrigerator. 7 months. 7 months since she had last seen him alive, and 7 months into her pregnancy. A bittersweet reminder of what he'd left behind. Suddenly, a sharp pain ripped through her abdomen like a bolt of lightning, cleaving her in two. She gasped, clutching the counter for support, as the plate she was washing slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. Another wave of pain surged, her legs buckling under her. "It's too early. It's too early." Sienna struggled to breathe, her mind spiraling into panic. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone on the counter, her vision blurring as the pain intensified. Each movement felt like scaling a mountain, every second stretching into an eternity. When she finally grasped the phone, she dialed for a cab, her voice strained and urgent. "Please," she begged the driver when he arrived moments later, "take me to the hospital, fast." The cab driver's face tightened with concern as he saw her clutching her belly, sweat glistening on her forehead. Without hesitation, he threw the car into gear and sped toward the hospital, weaving through traffic like a man possessed. Sienna's breaths came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she whispered prayers between cries of pain. "You're gonna be okay," the driver reassured her, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "We'll get there in no time." But Sienna's mind raced with fear. The pain was relentless, each contraction a cruel reminder that her baby's life hung in the balance. By the time the hospital's bright lights came into view, her strength was nearly gone. In the emergency room, a whirlwind of activity surrounded her. Nurses and doctors sprang into action, wheeling her into a sterile room filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic. Dr. Matthews, a composed and experienced obstetrician, examined her with a furrowed brow. "We need to perform an emergency C-section," he said decisively, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Prep the room immediately." Sienna barely registered his words. Her head swam, and the fluorescent lights above blurred into streaks of white. The sound of medical jargon buzzed around her like static, meaningless and distant. All she could focus on was the rhythmic pounding of her heartbeat. Hers, and, she prayed, her baby's. As Dr. Matthews stepped out to scrub in, Sienna's vision darkened momentarily. When she blinked back to awareness, a figure approached her, his face obscured by a surgical mask and cap. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as he gestured for the assisting doctor to begin. The room's atmosphere shifted, an undercurrent of unease weaving through the air. Sienna's instinct screamed that something was wrong. Her heart pounded, the rhythmic beep of the monitor beside her matching its frantic pace. The masked man moved closer, his presence looming like a shadow over her fragile state. "This isn't right," she thought, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle. She tried to speak, to protest, but her voice was little more than a whisper. A nurse leaned over her, her expression calm but strained. "It's okay," she said gently, her words a hollow reassurance. "You're safe?" "Safe!" The word echoed in Sienna's mind like a cruel joke as she succumbed to the numbing embrace of anesthesia. Darkness claimed her, but unease lingered in the corners of her mind, a foreboding shadow she couldn't shake. Don't forget to like, subscribe to Voice channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new information. Unbeknownst to her, the masked man hesitated, his gloved hands trembling ever so slightly. His eyes darted around the room, paranoia seeping into his movements, yet the baby's arrival interrupted his uncertainty. A piercing wail filled the room, sharp and primal, cutting through the tension like a knife. As the masked man lifted the baby, the crying stopped abruptly. A profound silence settled, heavy and unnatural. The man's hands shook as the newborn's gaze locked onto his, unblinking and unsettlingly knowing. Did you hear that?" The masked man stammered, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of the nurses asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. The man recoiled as though struck, dropping the baby onto Sienna's chest, his eyes widened in terror, his breath ragged. "Get him away from me!" he screamed, stumbling back before bolting out of the room. The surgical team froze, their confusion palpable. They glanced at one another, questioning silently what had just transpired. The baby let out another cry, its voice shattering the silence, while Sienna's chest rose and fell weakly beneath him. But then Sienna's body convulsed. Monitors blared warnings, their shrill alarms slicing through the air. Her lips turned blue, her body limp. "She's coding!" one nurse shouted, panic overtaking the room. "Inject 1 milligram of epinephrine," the assisting doctor barked. Time seemed to slow as the injection was administered. The seconds stretched, the baby's cries growing louder, almost pleading. Then, with a shuddering gasp, Sienna's heart restarted. Her eyes fluttered open, the dim light catching the tears that streamed down her face. The baby lay on her chest, his tiny hand clutching weakly at the hospital gown. "You're my miracle," Sienna whispered, her voice breaking. But even in that moment of relief, the shadow of the masked man lingered in her mind, his terror etched into her memory. She clutched her baby tighter, a silent vow forming in her heart. No matter what it took, she would protect him. Unbeknownst to her, outside the delivery room, a storm was brewing. The quiet that followed Sienna's revival was deceptive, fragile as a thread stretched to its breaking point. She lay still, her body heavy with exhaustion, the baby nestled against her chest. The sterile light of the delivery room seemed to pulse, casting odd shadows on the walls, as if the room itself were alive, watching. Sienna's breath hitched as fragments of memory clawed their way to the surface. The masked man's trembling hands, his panicked voice, and the way he fled haunted her like a half-remembered nightmare. Where is Dr. Matthews?" Johnny Phoenix grinned. "There are far more of you than you think to be dangerous." The nurse attending her hesitated, her hands stilling over the equipment. He'll be here soon," she said, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. Another nurse muttered something under her breath, her eyes darting to the doorway as if expecting someone or something to appear. The tension in the room was palpable, thick as smoke. It wrapped around Sienna, stoking her unease into a roaring flame. The baby stirred against her, letting out a small, plaintive cry that seemed to echo unnaturally. Sienna instinctively tightened her hold, drawing him closer. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though the words were as much for herself as for him. The door burst open suddenly, making everyone jump. Dr. Matthews stumbled in, his white coat askew and his face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by something Sienna had never seen before: fear. "Dr. Matthews," one of the nurses exclaimed, rushing to his side. "What happened?" He held up a trembling hand to silence her, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on Sienna. "Are you okay? Is the baby?" "We're fine," Sienna said. though her voice was edged with suspicion. "But something's not right. That man—" "An imposter," Dr. Matthews interrupted, his voice low but firm. He straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place, though the fear lingered in his eyes. "Someone attacked me in the locker room. He knocked me out and took my scrubs." Gasps rippled through the room, and the air grew heavier, suffocating. Sienna's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Who was he? What did he want?" Dr. Matthews hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't know his full intentions, but he mentioned your baby." The words landed like a punch, and Sienna's breath caught. "My baby? Why? What does he want with my child?" Before Dr. Matthews could answer, the nurse by the monitor let out a startled cry. "Doctor, look at this!" Everyone turned to the screen where the baby's vital signs were displayed. The numbers were stable, but a strange anomaly blinked intermittently. A faint, rhythmic pulse that didn't align with anything they had ever seen. "What is that?" Sienna demanded, her panic bubbling over. "I don't know," Dr. Matthews admitted, his brow furrowing. He leaned closer, his fingers flying over the controls as he tried to make sense of the data. The baby let out another cry, sharper this time, and the lights flickered. The room plunged into momentary darkness before the fluorescence buzzed back to life, casting everyone in harsh, unflattering light. Sienna's grip on her son tightened, her body trembling. "This isn't normal," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not," Dr. Matthews agreed, his tone grim. He turned to the head nurse. "Check the security footage. We need to confirm who that man was and what he did in here." Minutes stretched into eternity as the team scrambled to pull up the hospital's surveillance footage. Sienna watched the door, half expecting the masked man to return, his shadow looming larger than life. Every creak, every muffled sound from the hallway made her flinch. Finally, the head nurse returned, her face ashen. She held the tablet in trembling hands and handed it to Dr. Matthews. "You need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Matthews played the footage, the grainy video showing the imposter entering the delivery room. His movements were precise, almost practiced, but something about his body language was off, hesitant, nervous. As the footage continued, the imposter could be seen holding the baby, his gloved hands shaking. Then he froze, his head snapping up as though startled by something unseen. His lips moved, forming words the camera couldn't capture, and his eyes widened in terror. "What's he saying?" Sienna asked, her voice rising in pitch. Dr. Matthews shook his head. "There's no audio." The imposter's hands jerked, nearly dropping the baby, and he stumbled backward. His lips moved again, this time forming a single word, clear even without sound. "Murderer." The room fell silent. Even the hum of the monitors seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. If you find the story we bring today interesting, please comment "Great." If you feel the story is not attractive, please comment "Need more drama?" Sienna's chest tightened, her mind racing. "What does that mean? Why would he say that?" And before anyone could answer, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Shouts and hurried footsteps echoed, growing louder with each passing second. The door burst open again, this time admitting 2 police officers. "Mrs. Morgan," one of them said, his tone urgent. "We need to speak with you about the man who was in this room." Sienna's stomach churned. "You've caught him?" "No," the officer admitted, his expression grim. "But we've identified him. His name is Derek Hayes." The name hit her like a thunderclap. Derek, Ethan's assistant, the man who had been at her husband's side the night he died. Her mind reeled, memories flooding back in a torrent. Derek's smirks, his too friendly demeanor, the way he had lingered around her after Ethan's death. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began to click into place, forming a picture too horrifying to comprehend. "He's the one who killed Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And now he's after my baby." The officer nodded grimly. "We believe he may have tampered with your husband's car. We're working on locating him now, but he's gone into hiding." A nurse stepped forward hesitantly. "There's more," she said, her voice barely audible. "Before he ran, he tried to inject the baby with something, but it wasn't harmful. It was just glucose." "Glucose?" Sienna repeated, her brow furrowing. "Why?" I think it was a message," Dr. Matthews said, his tone thoughtful. "He wanted us to think he was going to harm the baby, but he didn't. Maybe he wanted to scare us, or maybe something stopped him." The implications hung heavy in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Sienna looked down at her son, his tiny face serene despite the chaos that surrounded him. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered the imposter's final moments on the footage, the terror in his eyes, the word on his lips. What had he seen? What had he heard? And, most haunting of all, why did he run? Sienna's grip on her baby tightened as a fierce determination took root in her heart. Whatever the answers were, she would find them. She would protect her son at all costs. But even as she resolved to fight, a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered a chilling question she couldn't ignore. Was she protecting him from the world, or from something far more terrifying within him? The storm of emotions within Sienna mirrored the chaos that now engulfed her life. Fear and desperation coursed through her veins, but beneath them stirred something else, a primal determination, fierce and unyielding. The pieces of the puzzle Derek had left behind were now sharp shards of betrayal, cutting deep into her resolve. Yet, instead of breaking, Sienna found herself hardening, forging strength from the fire that burned in her chest. Hours after the police visit, the hospital buzzed with tension. Officers scoured the building for clues, security guards stood on high alert, and Dr. Matthews and his team huddled in hushed conversations. But Sienna sat in her hospital bed, cradling her son, her mind no longer spinning. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice low but steady. The door to her room creaked open and Officer Grayson stepped inside. His face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes held a spark of determination. "We found him," he said simply. Sienna's breath caught. "Where?" Just awesome. "Where is the quarantine team?" "At the docks," Grayson replied. "He's trying to flee, but there's something else." He hesitated, then added, "He's asking to speak to you. Only you." The word sent a chill down Sienna's spine, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to let fear take hold. "Take me to him," she said, her voice firm. Grayson hesitated. "Mrs. Morgan, it's dangerous. He... "I'm going," Sienna interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This ends tonight." The air at the docks was damp and heavy, carrying the tang of salt and decay. Shadows loomed like silent sentinels under the pale glow of the moon, and the distant lapping of water against the pier added an eerie rhythm to the scene. Sienna stepped out of the car, her baby securely strapped to her chest in a carrier. She felt the weight of him, his warmth grounding her in the face of the unknown. Derek stood at the edge of the pier, his silhouette stark against the silver-lit water. He was hunched, a man who had lost his air of confidence, replaced by the jittery movements of someone cornered. As Sienna approached, flanked by officers who kept a cautious distance, he turned. His eyes, once calculating and sharp, were now wild with fear. He took a shaky step forward, raising his hands. "Sienna!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Please, I didn't mean for it to go this far." Sienna's steps faltered, but only for a moment. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze hard as steel. "You killed Ethan," she said, each word laced with quiet fury. "You tried to take my child. Why? Was it greed? Revenge?" Derek's hands trembled and he shook his head violently. "No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't kill Ethan. He brought it on himself. He wouldn't listen, wouldn't share what was rightfully mine." "Rightfully yours?" Sienna spat, her voice rising. "He trusted you and you betrayed him." Derek's eyes darted to the baby, and his expression twisted into something between awe and terror. "You don't understand," he whispered. "That child, there's something wrong with him. He spoke to me, Sienna. In the delivery room, he spoke, and he knows what I did." Sienna's blood ran cold, but she refused to let him see her fear. "You're insane," she said, though the memory of the strange moments in the delivery room clawed at the edges of her mind. "You think you can use your delusions as an excuse for everything you've done?" Derek took another step back, the heels of his shoes teetering on the edge of the dock. "I saw it in his eyes," he said, his voice trembling. "He called me a murderer. I heard it, clear as day. And you know what? He's right. I killed Ethan. I had to. He was in my way." The confession hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. The officers stepped forward, their radios crackling, but Sienna held up a hand to stop them. "Oh, you're going to pay for what you did," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for Ethan, but for every lie, every betrayal. You'll rot in a cell, and you'll remember this moment every day for the rest of your miserable life." Derek's composure shattered completely. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he lost his balance. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed he would fall into the cold, dark water below. But an officer lunged, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him back to safety. As they cuffed him, Derek screamed, his voice a raw, animalistic wail. "Keep him away from me," he shouted, his eyes locked on the baby. "He's not normal. He's not human." Sienna watched as they dragged him away, his cries echoing across the empty docks. For the first time since Ethan's death, she felt a flicker of peace. Back at the hospital, Sienna stood by the window of her room, looking out at the city lights. The baby slept peacefully in his bassinet, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that soothed her frayed nerves. Grayson entered quietly, holding a small recording device. "We have his confession," he said. "He's going away for a long time." Sienna nodded, her gaze still on the lights. "Thank you," she said softly. Grayson hesitated. "There's one more thing," he said. "The footage from the delivery room, we had it analyzed. There's no audio, but we found something strange." Sienna turned to him, her heart tightening. "What is it?" Grayson's expression was unreadable as he handed her a tablet. She hesitated, then pressed play. The footage showed Derek holding the baby, his face pale and drawn. His lips moved, and, though there was no sound, the word he mouthed was unmistakable. "Murderer." Sienna's hand trembled as she set the tablet down. Her gaze shifted to the bassinet where her son lay sleeping. His face was angelic, innocent, but the memory of Derek's terror, his unhinged screams, lingered. For a moment, doubt crept in, cold and unwelcome. Had Derek truly lost his mind, or had he seen something she couldn't explain? Sienna shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. "You're my son," she whispered, leaning over to brush her fingers across his cheek. "You're my miracle, and no one will ever hurt you again." But as she turned off the lights and settled into bed, a single word echoed in the back of her mind. a whisper that refused to be silenced. Murderer? And, for the first time, Sienna wasn't sure who it referred to. The night outside Sienna's hospital room was unnaturally quiet. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though it, too, waited for the dust to settle after the chaos. Sienna sat in the glow of a single bedside lamp, her son swaddled in soft blankets, sleeping soundly. His tiny hand curled into a fist, his fragile breaths a balm to her frayed nerves. She watched him, her mind replaying every moment of the nightmare she'd just endured. Derek's screams lingered in her ears, his words, unhinged and desperate, felt like splinters lodged deep in her psyche. She wanted to dismiss them as the ravings of a guilty man cornered by his own sins. Yet, as much as she wanted to believe it was over, a small voice in her head whispered otherwise. The knock on the door startled her. It was soft but deliberate, pulling her back into the moment. Officer Grayson entered, his expression calmer now, but still edged with concern. He carried a file tucked under his arm, and his presence felt both reassuring and ominous. "We've officially booked Derek," he began, his voice low as though not to disturb the baby. "He confessed to sabotaging Ethan's car and admitted to planning to harm you and your son." Sienna nodded, the weight of the words settling over her like a heavy blanket. "Is he still saying those things? About my baby?" Her voice wavered, betraying the fear she tried so hard to suppress. Grayson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He's unstable. It's clear his guilt has eaten away at him, and he's using your son as a scapegoat to justify his actions. But the good news is that the evidence against him is overwhelming. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars." It should have been a relief, but Sienna found no solace in the officer's words. "Thank you, Officer Grayson," she said softly, "for everything." He offered a small nod, leaving her alone once more with her thoughts. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, wrapping around her like a shroud. She turned her attention back to her son, reaching out to brush her fingers against his soft cheek. "You're safe now," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. "Nothing will ever hurt you." The following day, sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, golden and warm, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. Sienna sat up in bed as Dr. Matthews entered, his demeanor brisk yet kind. "You're recovering well," he said, flipping through her chart. "And your baby is healthy, which is the most important thing." Sienna nodded but didn't respond. Dr. Matthews paused, lowering the chart to meet her gaze. "You've been through an extraordinary ordeal," he said gently. "It's normal to feel unsettled. If you need someone to talk to, we can arrange for counseling." "I appreciate it," Sienna replied, her voice distant. "But I think what I need most is to go home." Dr. Matthews hesitated but eventually nodded. "You'll be discharged tomorrow. Until then, try to rest." Rest. The word felt foreign, almost absurd. How could she rest when her world had been turned upside down, when questions still lingered, unanswered and unhaunting? Later that evening, a nurse arrived with a tablet. "I thought you might want to review the security footage again," she said, her tone cautious. "It's all been logged, but I noticed something I thought you should see." Sienna frowned, her chest tightening. She wasn't sure she wanted to see more, but curiosity and an uneasy sense of duty pushed her to take the device. The footage played out much as she remembered. Derek's erratic behavior, his panicked retreat, and the eerie moment he mouthed "murderer." But this time the nurse had zoomed in on Derek's face. His wide, terrified eyes seemed to stare at something just beyond the camera's frame. "Pause it," Sienna said, her voice sharper than she intended. The nurse complied, freezing the footage. Sienna leaned closer, her heart pounding. Derek's gaze wasn't on her son. It was directed slightly above him, as if he were seeing something no one else could. "What is he looking at?" Sienna murmured. The nurse shook her head. "I don't know, but there's one more thing." She pressed play again, advancing the footage frame by frame. Just as Derek stumbled back, the baby stirred in his arms. His tiny face turned toward the camera, and for a split second, his lips moved. Sienna's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." "It's probably just a coincidence," the nurse said quickly, though her voice was shaky. "A trick of the light or a quirk in the recording. Babies can't—" "I know," Sienna interrupted, her tone sharp. "I know babies can't talk." But the image burned in her mind, the almost imperceptible movement of her son's lips. It was nothing, she told herself. It had to be nothing. The drive home the next day was surreal. The streets seemed brighter, the world more vibrant, but Sienna felt like she was moving through a dream. Her house, once a sanctuary, now felt foreign and too quiet. She carried her son inside, setting him gently in his crib. As she stood there watching him sleep, the weight of everything she'd endured came crashing down. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as tears streamed down her face. For months, she had fought to hold herself together, for her baby's sake, for her own. But now, in the stillness of her home, the cracks in her armor began to show. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was Officer Grayson. She answered hesitantly. "We reviewed more of the footage," he said without preamble. "We think we know why Derek was so terrified." Sienna's grip on the phone tightened. "What did you find?" There was a pause before Grayson replied, his voice laced with unease. "It's not clear, but there's a reflection in one of the monitors. We can't explain it, but it looks like a figure, a shadow, something standing near the baby." Sienna's heart raced. She glanced at the crib, her son sleeping peacefully. Her logical mind rebelled against the idea, but deep down, a cold dread crept into her soul. "Do you think it's real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grayson sighed. "I don't know. It could be a glitch or it could be nothing at all, but whatever it is, Derek saw it, and he believed it was real." As the call ended, Sienna sat in silence, her thoughts spiraling. She rose slowly and approached the crib, her shadow stretching long across the room. Her son stirred, his tiny fist reaching upward as if grasping for something unseen. "You're safe," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. The house creaked softly, the wind outside brushing against the windows like a whispered warning. Sienna turned off the light, the room plunging into darkness. She stood by the crib, her hand on her son's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. But in the back of her mind, a question lingered, a question she dared not speak aloud. Was it over, or was this just the beginning? The early morning light filtered through the nursery window, painting the room in soft hues of gold and lavender. Sienna stood by the crib, her hands gently resting on its edge. Her son slept peacefully, his tiny form radiating an innocence that felt almost sacred. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sienna's chest didn't feel tight with fear. Instead, there was a strange, fragile calm, a glimmer of something she hadn't dared to feel in months. Hope. The memories of the past days were still fresh, their edges sharp and jagged. Derek's betrayal, the eerie whispers of the impossible, and the lingering questions that might never have answers. It all loomed like a storm on the horizon. Yet, as she watched her son stir in his sleep, she felt an undeniable pull toward the present, a grounding force that tethered her to what truly mattered. "You're my miracle," she whispered, her voice steady and full of quiet resolve. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The words felt like a promise, not just to her son, but to herself. She had been broken by loss, paralyzed by fear, and haunted by betrayal, but she had survived. And in surviving, she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The house was still, and the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The past no longer clawed at her like a relentless shadow. Instead, it felt distant, like a heavy book she had finally closed. There would be questions she might never answer, mysteries that might linger. But there was also life ahead, a future waiting to be written. Sienna bent down and gently kissed her son's forehead. His tiny hand twitched in response, grasping the air as if reaching for her. She smiled, her heart swelling with a warmth that chased away the lingering chill of doubt. "Thank you for saving me," she murmured, her words a prayer, a vow, and a declaration all at once. As she turned to face the new day, her steps were lighter, her spirit steadier. The storm had passed, and though the scars remained, Sienna knew she was no longer defined by them. She was a mother, a survivor, and a woman stepping forward, stronger than ever, with hope burning bright in her heart.